6 days ago, at about 9:15 in the morning, Beijing time, an Iranian diplomatic delegation boarded a China Eastern flight out of Tehran. The destination was not announced, the meeting was not on any public calendar, and the conversation they were flying to continue had, according to the reporting stitched together afterward by Asian and European officials, already been running in silence for 6 weeks. That is where this story begins. Not in Islamabad, not on Truth Social, not at the press conference where the ceasefire was presented to the world like a diplomatic achievement jointly managed by Pakistan and blessed by Donald Trump. It begins with a quiet flight to Beijing, because the real story is not that a ceasefire appeared on the 8th of April. The real story is that China pressured Iran into accepting a ceasefire framework weeks before Washington understood who was actually writing the terms. Trump was still talking as if he controlled the war. China was already shaping how it would end. That is the axis of the whole story. If you miss that, everything else looks random. The Pakistani announcement looks decisive. The American celebration looks plausible. The later collapse in Islamabad looks like a misunderstanding. But if you follow the money first, then the whole structure changes. China was not sitting on the side of this war, waiting to see who won. China was holding the most important lever in the entire conflict. For the last several years, China has been the overwhelming buyer of Iranian crude. Not one buyer among many, the buyer that mattered above all the others. Chinese estimates have repeatedly put China's share at roughly 85 to 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil exports. These barrels rarely appear cleanly in official customs language. They move through dark fleet transfers, reflagging, relabeling, and ship-to-ship handoffs. On paper, they can become Malaysian or Omani crude. In reality, they are Iranian. And before this war, that flow was worth roughly 1.6 million barrels a day. That number is not just a trade statistic. That number pays the Iranian state. That number funds the system. That number keeps ministries operating, salaries moving, subsidies alive, and hardline power centers from staring directly into the fiscal cliff. And on the 12th of March, 2 weeks into the war, that flow stopped, not gradually, not symbolically stopped. Chinese state linked refiners and the teapot buyers in Shandong, who had for years absorbed Iranian crude under layers of plausible deniability, were given informal guidance to pause new Iranian contracts and refuse cargoes that could not show clean, secured passage. No dramatic speech announced it. No banner headline declared it. Beijing did not need to explain the move in public. It simply stopped buying. That is how China talks to Iran when it wants to be understood, not through threats, through missing money. Within roughly 72 hours, Iranian oil exports to China collapsed from around 1.6 million barrels a day to under 300,000. That is not a squeeze, that is a shock, and it landed at the exact moment wartime expenditure was rising. Sanctions pressure was already deep, inflation was already brutal, and the Iranian state was running far closer to the edge than its public image suggested. That is the moment most people still do not understand. America was bombing, America was threatening, America was talking the language of unconditional surrender, and yet the pressure that actually broke Tehran's position was not an American carrier group, it was a Chinese purchasing freeze, according to the reporting that surfaced afterward. By the 17th of March, Iran's leadership had already convened an emergency session to answer a much simpler question than all the ideological language implied. How long can the state function if China does not resume buying? The answer, from the economic side, was brutally short, not indefinitely. Not even close. The government has weeks, not months, before the financial architecture of ordinary state function began to seize up, not the heroic rhetoric of resistance, the basic machinery of government, salaries, pensions, subsidies, import financing, letters of credit, the things that keep a state from becoming an empty shell. This is why China's pressure worked where American military force did not. Iran had prepared for American kinetic pressure for decades. The Islamic Republic was built to survive bombs, assassinations, sabotage, cyber attacks, and coercive military shocks. It had structured its system around the assumption that the main external threat would come in the form of violence. What it had not built itself to survive was the quiet withdrawal of its one indispensable economic backstop by the country. It had spent years treating as its strategic counterweight to the West. That was the psychological rupture. Not just that money stopped moving, but that the partner assumed to be the long game insurer of Iran's survival had suddenly reminded Tehran that the partnership was conditional. And then Beijing did the most important thing of all. It did not just apply pressure. It translated pressure into terms. According to later reporting, Wang Yi communicated a framework to Abbas Araqi in late March. The message was not complicated. China was prepared to restart oil purchases. Chinese credit channels and post-war reconstruction support could move, but only if Iran accepted a path out of the war that China could live with. The conditions mattered. Iran had to accept a ceasefire framework that did not make American withdrawal from the Gulf a precondition. Iran had to reopen Hormuz for commercial traffic on a defined timeline. Iran had to stop attacks on Gulf oil infrastructure, and Iran had to allow a Chinese-backed mediation track to operate alongside and in the decisive phase effectively above the Pakistani channel. This was the actual turning point. China was not just telling Iran to stop. China was offering to underwrite the cost of stopping. That is real leverage. Military pressure can destroy financial leverage, can redesign the choice architecture of the state you are pressuring. And that is what Beijing did. Iran accepted the broad framework on the 27th of March. The ceasefire publicly announced on the 8th of April was not the birth of that deal. It was the packaging of that deal. The architecture was Chinese. The delivery system was Pakistani. The branding, for a brief moment, was American. That mismatch between authorship and public credit explains almost everything that happened afterward. Because when the United States arrived in Islamabad expecting to fill in the details of a ceasefire it thought military pressure had produced, it ran into a much harder reality. Iran had already committed in writing to terms that were not built around Trump's maximal demands. They were built around a Chinese concept of a survivable settlement. That meant no unconditional surrender, no complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear position on the timetable Washington wanted, no grand symbolic humiliation that could be sold as total American victory. Instead, the framework contained phased reopening, negotiated nuclear timelines, escalation clauses, and even provisions that implied eventual reduction of the American combat footprint as a confidence-building measure. That was the point at which the talks in Islamabad began to rot from the inside, because Washington discovered too late that it had not arrived to write the settlement. It had arrived to discover one already existed, and when the American side pushed back, Iran did something it almost never does in such negotiations. It produced prior documentation, not with Washington, not with Pakistan, with Beijing in the background. That is the moment the war changed politically, not because America lost on the battlefield. American military power remained overwhelming in the kinetic dimension, but kinetic dominance and settlement control are not the same thing. That is the mistake Trump made. He thought running the war's violent phase meant he still owned the peace. China understood something more sophisticated. In a conflict like this, especially one tied to shipping, oil inflation, and global market risk, the actor that can finance the exit can outrank the actor that dominates the battlefield. That is why Trump's blockade order after the collapse of the Islamabad talks looked less like strategy and more like reflex. It was the reaction of a president who had just discovered that the outcome of his own war was being shaped through financial pipes and diplomatic channels he did not control. And 5 days into that blockade, the evidence of the problem was already visible. Iranian exports did not vanish. They rerouted. Tankers carrying Iranian crude began moving toward Gwadar, the Pakistani port operated under long-term Chinese control. Cargo could be transferred there and continue east under cover. That made direct American interdiction politically explosive. What Washington could theoretically stop, it could not practically stop without inviting a crisis with both Pakistan and China. That is why the blockade looked loud but felt hollow. It was visible enough to declare. It was not effective enough to sever the economic lifeline China had already partially re-engineered. By mid-April, export volumes had already started climbing again from wartime lows, still below pre-war numbers, yes, but rising. That rise mattered because it proved that Beijing's pause had never been a divorce. It had been discipline. China had shut the tap to force Iran into a framework, not to destroy the relationship. And once Iran moved into that framework, China resumed playing the role of economic guarantor. Then came the public signals. Wang Yi began talking about freedom of navigation in language that mirrored the legal vocabulary Washington itself had used for years elsewhere. The People's Bank of China announced a new settlement mechanism with Iran denominated in yuan shi, and Putin discussed a multilateral Persian Gulf security structure centered on regional states, rather than external powers. None of these steps was random. Together, they meant something clear. Beijing was no longer acting defensively around an American World War. It was pressing forward into the settlement space and trying to define the post-war order. That is the deeper humiliation for Washington. Not that America lacked firepower, not that it failed to punish, but that it discovered too late that punishment was not the same as leverage. China could offer Iran something the United States could not. A path that allowed the Islamic Republic to remain itself, survive economically, keep its governing system intact, and move into a regional framework where Chinese finance and Chinese diplomacy mattered more than American coercion. From Tehran's point of view, that is not capitulation. That is survival. And survival is what regimes choose when ideology meets arithmetic. This is why the question now is not who gets credit for the ceasefire. The question is who actually has leverage over the next phase of the war. And right now that answer is not Washington, it is Beijing. From here, the future branches into three broad possibilities. Trump can escalate further, trying to break the Chinese authored framework before it hardens. That means more direct coercion, more dramatic action, more effort to prove that the United States still sets the boundaries. But that path risks forcing China into more overt material support for Iran and turning a regional war into a larger strategic confrontation. The second possibility is quieter and more likely the Chinese framework simply absorbs the apparent collapse of the Islamabad talks. The blockade remains declared, but porous Iranian exports continue rebuilding through alternative channels. New talks emerge elsewhere, possibly Beijing or Muscat, and the substance ends up looking remarkably similar to the Chinese structure already on paper. Trump gets a face-saving role because the alternative is publicly admitting he did not control the settlement. The third possibility is the one Washington does not want to discuss openly: managed retreat. The blockade is lifted, the U.S. footprint begins easing back toward pre-war levels, the Chinese-backed framework becomes the operating post-war reality. American military prestige stays largely intact, but American political primacy in the Gulf is quietly diminished. I do not know which of those paths will win, but I know which one China has been preparing for. And I know what this war already revealed. The real story was never just about missiles, air defenses, ships, or social media declarations. American power dominated the kinetic opening of the war. But the settlement architecture, the one that actually decides how a war ends, was being shaped in Beijing while Washington was still talking, as if the only language that mattered was force. That is what losing control of your own war looks like in the 21st century. Not defeat under fire, not collapse on the battlefield, but the discovery that the terms of the outcome are being written elsewhere by the rival power you spent the last decade telling your own public was the primary threat. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender. There is now a deal taking shape. It is not unconditional. And if there is any surrender in this story, it is not Iran surrendering to America. It is Washington slowly discovering that the region it thought it could still discipline is already learning to route around it. The tankers are moving through Gwadar. The UN channels are live. The Pakistani public track is dead or dying. The Chinese private track is still running. And somewhere in Beijing, Iranian officials are not negotiating whether there will be a post-war order. They are reviewing the terms of one that is already being built. That is not the end of this story. It is the start of the next phase. And the next phase looks much less like American control than Washington is prepared to admit.